Okay, this is Janelle Denzen. I am presenting on homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing in HMIS. This is a redo of the webinar that we did on December 11th, in which the audio was not working correctly, and you might hear sirens going off in the building, and I apologize for that, but we're going to carry on. There is nothing wrong. Okay, so we're going to get started here. We're talking about rapid rehousing in general and HP, which is homelessness prevention in general, and putting clients that are rapid rehousing and homeless prevention into HMIS. So some of this will apply to both HCRP and SSVF, and there are parts that actually don't apply to SSVF, and I'll try to make that clear when we get there. So basically, all clients receiving any prevention or rapid rehousing services besides intake should be entered into HMIS, or if your agency is a victim service provider, a comparable database. And if you have questions about that, then you should contact us, and we'll try and help you figure that out. Households placed into housing using HCRP program rules and staff, but whose financial services are actually funded with non-HCRP money, should be entered into the appropriate provider. So if you have a client, let's say you're out of prevention money, but you have some United Way money, and you want to use the HCRP, programs and rules and the case manager to help keep them in housing, you would enter those clients into HCRP and just mark that the funding source is something other than HCRP. And then the third point is that any clients that go through intake and are eligible but then they don't receive further services should not be entered into your HCRP provider. So you can, if the client, for instance, does not actually go through with agreeing to receive the services, or if they agree but they fall out of contact with the case manager, then those clients would not go into your HCRP provider. Okay, so the next slide is about entry dates. And the reason that this is a big deal lately is that when HUD they added the move-in date field to the assessment for rapid rehousing projects, they did that with the express idea of measuring how rapid is rapid. So they want to know from the time that you agreed to serve the client, and well, from their entry date, we'll get to what an entry date is in a second, until the day that they move into housing, how long is that? How rapid is rapid? This is the definition of an entry date, and it hasn't changed since HPRP, but looking at the data, it seems that some folks have been using the move-in date as the entry date. This is one of the reasons for this webinar, to go through what the entry date is, what an exit date is, and get that sorted out. So the definition is the first date on which the following criteria are met. The client has submitted all their paperwork, the client is determined to be eligible, the agency has agreed to provide services, and the client has agreed to receive services. So this would be their entry date. And notice it is not contingent on having a place in mind to put the clients, and it's not contingent on inspections or anything like that having been done. It's simply between the client and the agency that the entry date is referring to. So as I sort of covered before, the move-in date is for rapid rehousing only, and that refers to the date the client moves into housing. So that's the entry date. The exit date is just defined as the date the client receives their last service, and this can include case management. So a couple of scenarios: the situation where the client stops engaging with the case manager. In this case, the exit date should be the date of the last service received, likely the last rent payment date. It also includes situations where the client is determined to be no longer eligible. So if you meet with your client for a recertification after 90 days and the recertification shows that that client or that household is not eligible anymore, then their exit date would be the date of that, the date that y'all met and you did the case management for the recertification. So hopefully that clears up a lot of the ambiguities around what an entry date is and an exit date is for rapid rehousing and prevention clients. Now, if you've been doing things differently than what we just covered, then the corrections that we would need made, you would need to go back to October 1st. And this is the first date that move-in date field was available, and that's why we wouldn't want to make you go back further than that. To find out if you do have these issues, you would want to run your data quality entry, exits, and assessments report, and I'll run through how to do that in a second to see if you are having that problem. And a note to go over too is that once you've made these changes, it may cause overlaps in programs days between shelters and rapid rehousing projects, and that's okay, because that is actually the truth, because they are in a shelter, they're living there, but they're also being rapidly rehoused, so they are really essentially in two programs at the same time. So I'm going to cut away from the presentation here. I'm going to check for questions. And, okay, there is one question. If they're no longer making payments due to client successfully maintaining housing, but they still want to remain on case management, should they be closed out of HMIS or kept open? It would depend, I would imagine, on what the case management is doing. If it's keeping them in housing, it would make sense to leave them open. But if it is simply checking in and doing like follow-up work, then you would close them once you stopped working to be sure that they're keeping their housing. Okay, thank you for the question. I'm going to go through the steps of figuring out if you need to make any corrections at all, and if so, how you do it. Basically, the first step would be to run your data quality report, the one that's for entry, exits, and assessments. And then on the second tab, the missing and DKR2, you'll see this is what that tab looks like. And I ran it on someone and I redacted their name and their client IDs so that we can, oh wow, that's big. Okay, I'm just going to leave it like this. Basically, you can see here that in permanent housing and move-in date have a bunch of like questionable here, and there's some that are missing, which obviously would need to be corrected. And then the move-in dates are either labeled as not correct or questionable. So the idea of questionable versus not correct is, I'm told that it is possible to actually rapidly rehouse somebody the same day that you intake them and everything is sorted out. Their entry date really actually is the same date as their move-in date. But it's a very, very rare occurrence. So when the days between the entry date and move-in date are 0, I'm returning questionable on this data quality report. But if it's, so this is the days between the entry date and the move-in date is negative, to me that's totally not correct, because this means that the entry date was after the move-in date, which makes no sense. So that is why you'll see these here. So in order to find out whether or not you have any of these problems, you should run this report, look at the missing and DKR2 tab to see how yours looks. So this agency has quite a few corrections. So the problem with making corrections to entry dates, moving entry dates back, is that all the entry assessment data has to be re-entered. And that is what makes this kind of a monumental task here, and why we're doing a webinar to make it clear as to what it is that needs to be done. So what happens if you simply move your entry date back and click Save and Continue, all your assessments data seemingly disappears. This leaves no way to re-enter it all aside from pulling the client file or making screenshots prior to moving the entry date back or some other Rube Goldberg machine type way. So in light of this, we created an ART report that simply shows you the entry assessment data at the client level so that you can run the report on your client or clients. So if you have your list of clients here, you can run the report on a handful of client IDs, and it will tell you what their assessment data is. And before I show you that report, I just want to also show you where the instructions are on this, so that you don't have to only use these instructions from the webinar. So if you go to the HMIS.cohio.org, right, is under data quality, and then I need to move an entry date back in time. How do I do that without losing my assessment data? So the instructions are here, and so you can use this later if you don't want to try to rely on notes that you're taking during this webinar. Okay, so then just to show you that report that I was talking about, when you run it, you will see your client ID at the top, and it gives you the entry and exit date. So this client has multiple entry exits, one where they entered in August of 2011 and exited in November of 2013, and then they entered the program again on November 19th, and they're still in the program. So the first time they came, their entry assessment data looked like this. So their residence prior was a substance abuse treatment facility, whereas when they presented in November, their residence prior was staying with a friend. So you can see here the difference between the data. And then you'll see here it says see below for sub-assessment data. So as you're entering the data into the assessment, you will have to come down here to find out if there were any disability sub-assessments there or income sub-assessments. And you can see here that they had 4 income sub-assessments with amounts. Okay, so just to quickly go through and show you how to run, well, let's see. Yeah, how to run that report that I just showed you. Once you get logged in, you can go to your ART tree here. And then again, this is in the instructions that are on the help desk, the portal thing. But just to show you, you go to Public, and then Balance the State HMIS, and then the As Needed folder, and it's this report right here, Client Data at Entry. So once you click that, okay. I'm just going to run it on some fake clients since we are on the live site, and this is a public webinar. And you can actually run it on multiple client IDs. So in this case, I'm going to run it on clients 5 and 4216. So the first thing I'm going to do is put in 5 and 4216. But you notice there's this other one in there already that we do not want to see. So I'm going to take that one out. You select it and then hit the left arrow, and then it disappears. So as long as your client IDs are in here, they're going to go into the prompts for the report. And then you just run it, and then it will show you the entry assessment data for each of those client IDs. And it merely shows you what was entered. It doesn't mean it was correct. It doesn't mean that it was complete. All it shows you is what is there. Okay, so you can see here, Client 5 had an entry in October of 2014, and these are the answers to their assessment questions. And you can go to the next page. It's not perfectly formatted, apparently. And then you can find there to see if there's any sub-assessment data that needs to be re-entered. There no non-cash, there was no health insurance, no military, no last permanent address. And then another way to, and then if you wanted to look at the next client ID, you could click on this one and it'll carry you to that one, to that page. And that was on page 13. So you can either export this to Excel or PDF to help you with re-entering all that assessment data. Okay, so and if you haven't been clear on what the value of this report is up to now, I think you will be in a minute. So don't worry if you're wondering. Okay, I'm going to log into the training site, and we're going to go through a sample family that I have entered incorrectly. In a way that is very common as to what we're seeing in the data. So basically, we see this again and again. A family enters into a family shelter. This one entered September 1st and exited November 15th. And then they have a rapid rehousing entry that matches the same day they exited the shelter, because this was probably their move-in date. And it's unlikely that the entry date is correct here. So what we're going to do is we're going to correct it. So we're going to go to the entry pencil and move that entry date back to the date that they actually entered the rapid rehousing program. We're going to say that that is on 10/5. And now moving this back changes each of their entry dates because they're all checked there. And if you notice, all the data that I had entered there is gone and needs to be re-entered. And this is why we created the client data at entry report to help you with re-entering that data. So you can have your windows next to each other and go through the re-entry of the assessment data using this report that you ran on these client IDs. So ideally in this situation I would have run this report on client IDs 182, 183, and 184. And then I would be able to find all of their assessment data that was entered, and I could just re-enter it straight from this into here. And don't forget to, once you re-enter it all, you want to also enter it for all the household members. So we're going to pretend, okay, oh, and this is another thing. When you get down to here, the data on your client data at entry report will probably say, if in permanent housing, yes. If yes, date of move-in. And in this case, it would say 11/15, sorry. Because when you entered them into the program, they were in permanent housing, and their date of move-in was the same as their, what you were making the entry date. So, but in that case, you're not going to be entering that data into here because it's not correct. You've moved the entry date back, and all of this data here is supposed to be effective as of this date. But on 10/5, they were not in permanent housing, and you did not have a move-in date yet. So when you fill all of this data out and you get down to this question, you do not want to simply copy what's here into your entry assessment. You want to make this say no and save that. And then, you know, as you go through your household members, you would have to answer it for everybody. Once you're done re-entering your assessment data, then you would need to enter an interim for the date that they actually did move into housing. So in 11/15, when they entered into housing, you would go to your entry exit tab and click the interims button, do add interim review, check all your people. This would be an update. 11/15 was the day that they had to change. So you do save and continue. And here where it says in permanent housing no, you would switch that to yes. And then you can fill in that day's date of 11/15. Save that. And well, you want to answer whatever else has changed also, if there was anything else. And then move to the other household members and do the same thing. And then this question has to be answered for adults and children. So you want to be sure and hit all of your family members here. And that is how to correct any entry dates that were incorrect. We realize that it is extensive, but it's important that we have this data that's correct so that we can make these measurements that HUD is asking that we do. Let me just check for questions here. Okay, another question. If we miss 1 month of a payment, but would potentially need to make a payment the next month, should we be keeping clients open in HMIS? Will this cause an error in HMIS as if there isn't a service entered within a 30-day period? It will not cause an error. As to not paying rent every single month, but having them remain in the program, as long as you're working with the client to keep them in housing, they can remain in the program. And then if the next month comes around and you don't need to, and you determine that you don't need to pay another month's rent, then you can make that exit date the last date that they received a service. The next question is, although not typical, occasionally it would happen that the move out of the shelter date and the date of the intake would be the same, along with the move-in date for their supportive housing. So in the rare case, would that be incorrect, even if they happen on the same day? In the rare cases that you are intaking somebody on the same day that you house them, it's only going to come up as questionable on the data quality report. It is not going to come up as not correct. So if it's questionable but it's correct, then leave it. That's why we're distinguishing on that data quality report between things that are rare but possible and things that just absolutely make no sense. If we do an intake with an agreement to help the client 3 or 4 weeks prior to finding stable housing, should we be doing the intake for the actual intake date? Not everyone is following through even when approved. So we've been waiting until they're ready to move in to enter the data into HMIS. So if you notice, one of the points here for entry date is that the client has agreed to receive services. Now, things change, obviously, and of course this is always going to be a gray area because you have people saying that I will do this, and things like this kind of those things don't always go through. But in general, if the client has agreed to receive services, then they would be entered into HMIS, and it would be the date that all of these things were true. The client submitted all the paperwork, they've been determined to be eligible, the agency has agreed to provide services, and the client has agreed to receive services. I'm going to move on from that, and hopefully the corrections make some sort of sense. So just to talk a little bit about service transactions for rapid rehousing and prevention. Each client should have at least one case management service transaction to indicate that client's intake process. Since the intake is part of case management, each client should also have a second service transaction of some kind besides case management. So it does not have to be financial. It can be housing search and placement if you successfully place a family into a house or an apartment, but you did not pay the deposit or the rent, but you got them into like low income housing somehow. That would definitely still count under HCRP. Recertifications must be done every 90 days, regardless of if we're talking prevention or rapid rehousing. Another issue around rapid rehousing and prevention is income eligibility. Now notice up here it says HCRP rapid rehousing clients. This is the time in the webinar that this does not apply to SSVF. For HCRP rapid rehousing, income is not an eligibility factor at entry. But for all rapid rehousing and prevention and all the other clients, you still have to collect income at entry on all adults. The only difference about income for rapid rehousing is that it's not an eligibility factor at entry. However, it is an eligibility factor at the 90-day recertification. Collecting income data on prevention clients, and just like everybody else, income is an eligibility factor at entry. Income is also an eligibility factor at all subsequent recertifications. And this is just a list of the grant managers in case there isn't clarity, although Samantha McCoskey has started her new job at OFA, so her regions will be going to different grant managers. And I'm sure that a new map will be on its way soon. So I'm just going to check the questions again, and then if there isn't anything else, I'll conclude the webinar. And please, if there are any questions, please send your questions to hmis@cohio.org, or give us a call if you just have concerns or would like us to look over a household for you to make sure that it's done correctly. We're happy to help you through this, and we appreciate everyone's time. And I really apologize for my voice and my cold during this webinar. So thanks for hanging through this with me. And I'm not seeing any more questions, so I'm going to close out here. Thanks again.